So in today's lesson, we'll be looking at some of the key events in the final year of World War II. After the successful D-Day invasion of France in 1944, the Allies had opened up a second front against Nazi Germany. This was the beginning of the end of the war for Germany, as the Soviets in the east and the American, British, and Canadian forces in the west made their final push towards Berlin. In today's lesson, we'll look at some of these final months of the war, as well as some of the key events that led to the end of the war, and we'll also look at some of the aftermath of the war. And these will be the key events that we'll look at. We'll start by looking at the Yalta Conference. We'll look at the surrender of Italy and Germany. We'll look at the Potsdam Conference. And we'll end by looking at the Nuremberg Trials. And so we'll start by looking at the Yalta Conference, which took place in February 1945 in Yalta, Soviet Union. And attending this conference were the leaders of the main three Allied countries, the three biggest countries. President Franklin Roosevelt of the U.S., Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Britain. And the purpose of this conference was to discuss what the world would look like after World War II. And here you can see these three men with Churchill on the left, FDR in the center, and Stalin on the right. Now, by the time of the Yalta Conference, it was generally understood that Germany was going to be defeated. That wasn't really up for debate at this point. Once D-Day had succeeded, the military leaders and the political leaders of these three countries sort of understood that it was only a matter of time before Germany was defeated. And so the big three went about planning what the end of the war should look like. They wanted to plan so as to avoid some of the issues that came out of the end of World War I. Think back to the Treaty of Versailles and how it kind of came together and, trying to learn from the mistakes that came out of that because, again, that was one of the motivating factors for why Germany was so mad leading into World War II. So these were some of the conditions that the Yalta Conference produced. One was that these three leaders wanted an unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan. And what we mean by unconditional surrender is that it's not a negotiated peace. It's not like the Nazis can come to the table and say, okay, we'll negotiate a surrender. We'll give you this. We'll give back the land that we had as long as we can stay in power or giving up any other sort of negotiation. None of that here. It's an unconditional surrender. They surrender and they're out of power and it's all up to the hands of the Allies. What happens to these countries after the war? Secondly, it was decided that Germany needed to be both demilitarized and denazified. By denazified, this literally meant changing the political and economic structure of Germany. The Nazis had really changed Germany into their image, and everything revolved around the Nazi Party. Everything from education to the economy to the government, it all revolved around Nazi ideology and to further the Nazi agenda. So this was a huge undertaking that needed to be done. You needed to have all these remnants of Nazi ideology removed from Germany following the war. And we still see many of these aspects of denazification today. So for example, in Germany today, it is still illegal to draw a swastika for anything other than educational purposes. It's illegal to deny the Holocaust. And the reason for this, again, some people might say, well, that's limiting people's free speech, and that is true. But the idea behind this is that if this wasn't done, you're just letting these Nazi sympathizers, stick around and perhaps come back to power one day. So they really needed to be strict in order to prevent the Nazis from ever coming to power again. Another condition that was agreed upon at the Yalta Conference was that Germany needed to be occupied following the war. So it wasn't going to be like the end of World War I where Germany was defeated and then they set up their own government and were back on their way. Because, again, that led to a lot of problems. There was economic uncertainty. You had, Hitler in 1923 trying to overthrow the government, and then he came to power 10 years later. They don't want a repeat of that. So the militaries of these countries, the Soviet Union, Britain, and America, they are going to occupy Germany for an indeterminate period of time following the war. It was agreed that Nazi war criminals would be brought to justice, so they would put them on trial and try them for the crimes that they committed throughout the war. And finally, it was agreed that there would be a creation of a United Nations. to replace the League of Nations, which had failed prior to World War II. However, shortly after Yalta, at the beginning of his fourth term, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, passed away. He had been in power at this point for about 13 years, and he had been suffering from poor health for a while. He had suffered from polio as a child, and he had trouble walking. He spent most of his time in a wheelchair, although this was not widely known as the media agreed not to make it public. And after FDR dies, the U.S. goes through a major grieving period, and his vice president, Harry Truman, takes over as president. And again, this leads to a bit of uncertainty. Although America and the Allies are, clearly on the path to victory, the fact that one of the major leaders of these countries dies so close to the end of the war, leaves a bit of uncertainty as to maybe how Truman's approach to the war might differ from Roosevelt's. And he has some major decisions to make going forward. Now, while the Allies were planning for the war to end, things were beginning to fall apart for the Axis powers. So we can trace this back even before D-Day. We can trace this back to 1943 with the invasion of mainland Italy. And Italy had really been reeling ever since then. Mussolini had been forced to resign. He was imprisoned by the king, Victor Emmanuel. And again, the Italian forces are really, they're having trouble dealing with the Allies. And quickly, the fascist government fell. So they signed an armistice with the Allies in September, and officially Italy declared war on Germany in October of 1943. Although there were still pockets of fascist resistance right till the end of the war. Now, Italy, as I was saying, had been in a state of war with these fascist resistance fighters trying to keep up the fight. And Mussolini, in fact, had been freed from jail by fascist supporters and was living in hiding. Now, towards the end of the war, they can kind of see that things are falling apart in Germany. On April 27, 1945, Mussolini tried to escape to Spain, which is also run by a fascist government, although they stayed officially neutral during the war. However, on his train ride there, he is discovered. And the next day, he was executed by Italian forces. You can see the two men at the bottom here. They are the two men who are given credit with executing him, and the rifle on the right side there is the one that was used to execute Mussolini. Now, this was a huge indignity. Mussolini was not only executed, but they did not treat him with much respect. By this point, Mussolini was pretty poorly disliked by the majority of people in Italy. Yes, he still had some supporters, but most people had been sick of what was going on in Italy. There was a huge backlash. People were sick of the war and were really blaming on what had happened to Italy. The fact that they were dragged into this war, they were blaming this on Mussolini. So Mussolini's body, after he was executed, was dragged through the streets. People spat on him, they threw rocks at his corpse, and finally he was hung upside down from a gas station, as we can see in this picture here, him with some of his supporters. And again, this is the ultimate indignity for him. Again, even in death, he's being treated with no respect. Meanwhile, in Germany, we had mass destruction of cities as the war was coming to an end. Both sides continued to heavily bomb cities until the end of the war. So the Allies heavily bombed German cities such as Berlin, Munich, Nuremberg, and Mannheim. And they targeted any and all targets, military targets, industrial targets, and civilian targets. And it's been described by some as a terror campaign. This was supposed to make the Germans scared and try to influence them to put pressure on the government to end the war quicker. And this had a huge toll on cities. Many saw enormous damage. So for example, over 75% of the buildings in Hamburg were destroyed by the bombing, and as many as 600,000 German civilians were killed. And here we can see what that destruction looks like, and it's absolute destruction. We can see buildings completely gutted, fires which just rage throughout cities, and no one can put them out. Entire city blocks destroyed. This picture on the right here is of a woman walking by and all the corpses just piled up in the streets. So this is what's happening to Germany in the final months of the war. Germany was using what it could, though, to try to fight back. So they actually had a new technology that they brought into the mix here. They were using V-1 and V-2 rockets to try to strike British cities. Now, at this point, long-range bombers are just starting to be developed. So Germany doesn't really have the capability at this point to send bombers from airfields in Germany, make it all the way to Britain, drop bombs, and fly back. They're only starting to develop that technology. So if they want to attack Britain directly, they were using technologies such as rockets. Literally the same rockets that they eventually used to send men into space. And although they were very powerful, they were not accurate. They could not be reliably used to destroy military targets. Essentially, they're just lobbing these in the general direction of Britain, hoping they hit something. So, yeah, if they did hit a target, it could do a lot of damage. But this picture on the far right here, you can see a truck that's on fire. What happened here was this is in the middle of a British city. This one car was struck by a rocket that hit it, and it killed one person. But again, this is really expensive, and it's using a lot of resources, and it didn't really do a whole lot of damage. It's really bad for the one person, obviously, who was killed here, but in terms of being a good military tool, the V-2 rocket was not highly successful. Now, although they were initially developed as a military tool, after the war, these rockets were used to send men into space. Many Nazi rocket scientists were allowed to defect to the US after the war. This was known as Operation Paperclip. So scientists such as Wernher von Braun became very influential in the early years of NASA and the American space program. So we can see sort of the final years of World War II directly leading into the space race following it. Now with that in mind, let's have a look at the last major battle in Europe, the Battle of Berlin. This was the final major offensive of the war in Europe, and it involved Soviet forces taking the area around Berlin. Now, we had Soviet forces fighting the war on the Eastern Front, and the British, American, and Canadian forces on the Western Front fighting the war. And it was really a race to see who could get to Berlin first. Again, it was generally assumed that Germany was going to be defeated. It was just a matter of time. But it was really a race to see who could get to Berlin first. And this would have major implications following the war as we lead to the Cold War. The Battle of Berlin really starts around January 12, 1945, and it lasted until the city was fully taken in early May. And this was a brutal fight, with fighting in the streets, people going door to door, building to building. It was brutal, it was deadly, and this was the final push to take down Nazi Germany. And Hitler had decided that he was going to stay in Berlin till the bitter end. He had informed their forces they were going to fight till the end. They weren't going to surrender. It was until anybody was left standing, you keep fighting. And Hitler decided to stay in his bunker in Berlin while this was going on. Now, as the Soviets closed in, Hitler started to realize that the end was near. And he was aware of what had happened to Mussolini just shortly before this, in the days leading up to the fall of Berlin. And he didn't want the same indignity to happen to him. So on April 30th, 1945, Hitler and his then wife, Eva Braun, committed suicide. They were actually married that same day, and then they killed themselves that night. So Hitler died via gunshot and took a cyanide pill as well. Afterwards, their bodies were burned. Again, they don't want the same indignity that happened to Mussolini to happen to Hitler. And Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's lieutenant, became Chancellor of Germany, although this is really just a formality because he then committed suicide the next day as well. The Nazi leadership, the ones who could not escape, decided they did not want to be captured by the Soviet forces. They were scared what was going to happen to them. So many of them committed suicide in the bunkers of Berlin as the Soviets closed in. And this all leads to VE Day. So once Germany falls, the remaining Nazi leadership has decided there's no way they can continue on with this war. In fact, the people who had taken over for Hitler and Goebbels, they had sort of approached the Allies, especially the Americans. They didn't want to surrender to the Soviets, so they were trying to stall the end of the war. They were trying to get as many forces to move to the Western Front as they could to surrender to the Americans, who they thought would give them better treatment. And they were trying to negotiate with the Americans, trying to negotiate, saying, we want this war to end, but we want, you to give us some stuff. The response from the Americans was, we will only accept an unconditional surrender. And on May 8th, 1945, the Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Americans. And this is known as VE Day, meaning Victory in Europe Day, because this part of the war was over, but we still have part of the war to end in the Pacific. And this leads to mass celebrations around the world. So you can see pictures here of Britain. There's parades in the streets, because people know now the war is over. Our soldiers are going to be coming home. Our family members are coming home. Now that the war was over, the leaders of these countries could finally decide what would happen following the war. So in July of that year, the Big Three once again met in Potsdam, Germany, to decide the future of Europe. And so we have now the Big Three are Harry Truman, the new President of the United States. Initially, Winston Churchill, still the Prime Minister of Britain, but he actually loses an election while he's at Potsdam, and the new Prime Minister of Britain is Clement Attlee, who comes in and takes over for him in the midst of the conference. And Joseph Stalin is still the leader because he's a dictator, so he doesn't have to worry about elections. And at Potsdam, they drew up a blueprint on how they were going to disarm Germany and eliminate the Nazi regime. And what happened was Germany was divided into 4 sections, which would be occupied by France, Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. Berlin would be divided up in the east. So the city of Berlin is actually located inside of what would be the Soviet zone. However, because it's the capital of Germany, it's a really important city, it was also decided that it would be divided up in the same fashion. And at Potsdam, they also set up the Nuremberg Trials to prosecute Nazi leaders. And it was also determined that, just like with Nazi Germany, Japan must also unconditionally surrender. This was going to be difficult, though, because for as hard as it was to get Germany to surrender, the Japanese culture made it even more difficult. Now here we can see what those occupation zones look like. So we can see in the east end, this is where the Soviet zone would be. Then we can see in the northwest corner, the British zone. In the south, we have the American zone. And then in the southwest, we have the French zone. And then here's a close-up of Berlin itself. We can see it's divided up in the same basic fashion. Again, this is very important because following the war, we end up with a divided Germany, an East and West Germany, similar to how we have a North and South Korea today. Germany ended up falling into a communist East and a democratic West as the Cold War develops. And this has massive implications for post-war Germany, as it helped lay the foundations for the Cold War. And here we can see these the new Big Three. So we have Clement Attlee, the new Prime Minister of Britain, on the left, Harry Truman in the center, and Joseph Stalin still on the right. Now it's also at Potsdam that Truman learns of a new secret weapon that the Americans had been working on for years, that it had been tested, and it had been tested successfully in New Mexico. He learned that the atomic bomb was ready to go. And he actually tells Stalin this at the conference, that America, we've been working on this new secret weapon. It can create just, sheer devastation. It's more powerful than any bomb we've ever had before. I just wanted to let you know that we have this, and we might use it on Japan if we have to. He thinks this is like a big secret. It's going to be, it's going to shock Stalin. And Stalin just kind of, took it and it's like, yep. Because he actually had spies on the inside of the Manhattan Project and had known about this all along. So it was not a secret to Stalin. Now, with that in mind, let's fast forward a couple of years and look at what happens following the war at the Nuremberg Trials. So this was an international tribunal court that tried Nazi officials following the war. and it started in November 1945 and ended in October 1946. Representatives from over 23 nations tried Nazi war criminals. 12 of the 22 defendants were sentenced to death, including Hermann Goering, and 200 other officials were found guilty but given lesser sentences. So in summary, today we learned that in February 1945, the Big Three decided at the Yalta Conference the conditions for German surrender. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide and Germany surrendered soon after. Following the war, Germany was split into 4 occupied zones. It became a communist East Germany and a democratic West Germany. After the war, the surviving German leadership was put on trial for war crimes at the Nuremberg Trials.